If you are new to the world of cybersecurity, I'm going to go out on a limb here to tell you that one of the most important foundation security frameworks that you need to get tucked away quite quickly is the CIA framework, or the CIA Triad. So coming up in this presentation, first of all, we're going to discuss what actually is the CIA. What does that mean to us within the world cyber? More importantly, I'm going to discuss how do we actually use this CIA framework within our day-to-day life within the world of information security, and then we'll go on to talk about some important risk controls which also dovetail in with the CIA framework. Probably the easiest part of understanding the CIA is knowing what the letters stand for, and for us that's simply confidentiality, integrity and availability. Occasionally you may see those letters in a different order, such as the ICA of security, but they all mean the same thing. And to be honest folks, I have no real understanding about why anybody would jumble those up, other than to avoid any confusion with the Central Intelligence Agency. Here of course we're talking about information security and data protection. It's also true to say, however, that the CIA, over the years that it's been in existence, has also kind of morphed into a framework which we can now apply to all areas of cybersecurity. So what do these words mean? Confidentiality can be quite difficult to actually define. So what I've done is relied on the good people at NIST to give us some definitions of what these terms mean. And their glossary of terms is also quite a good resource for you if you're studying within the world of cyber. And NIST defines confidentiality as preserving authorized restrictions on information access and disclosure, including means for protecting personal privacy and proprietary information. Now that's difficult for me to read, and also quite complex really when it comes to the fact that ideally all this is about is protecting data from unauthorized access. And you'll also notice folks that I've spelt unauthorized correctly. So getting down to the nitty-gritty of this, when we're talking about confidentiality of data or information, it's keeping things secret or confidential. Ultimately what we're trying to do is hide things from people that don't need to have access to it, and so only authorized people can access it because they need to, by using the appropriate means in order to gain access, and only for the time that they need it. There are lots of different principles that we also put into place here, such as the needs to know and hold principle, or the principle of least privilege. When it comes to defining integrity, NIST defines this as guarding against improper information modification or destruction, and includes ensuring information non-repudiation and authenticity. Now I particularly like this definition because it also leads us into some other concepts outside of the CIA, and that is non-repudiation and authenticity. I'll come on to talk about those later on in this presentation. Ultimately, when we're dealing with integrity, what we're trying to do here is ensure that the data has not been tampered with or altered unofficially, so that no unauthorized changes have been made. And this also then has an impact on the reliability, assurance and trust that we put on the data. And integrity also leads into this concept of non-repudiation, which I'll explain later on. And the third element within the CIA is all about maintaining availability of our systems, and this ensures timely and reliable access to the use of information. So this means that our data and the systems that support it are available to those that need it when they need it. Once again, you can see that we're talking about the need to know and hold principle, or the principle of least privilege. The way that we do this is that we layer in different techniques and technologies that make systems highly available. And we talk about high availability technologies. We can also layer in controls that allow us to provide redundancy and resilience of our systems. And again, we'll come on to discuss that later on. We talk a lot within the world of cybersecurity and information security about these frameworks. Now, a cybersecurity framework is purely just a set of guidelines, standards and best practices that enable an organisation to reduce a risk. Frameworks, however, also provide you with a structured approach to dealing with threats, vulnerabilities and the overall risk factors, And most importantly, they allow organizations to meet security objectives, and that may be for legal, regulatory, or standard compliance. And there are lots of different frameworks out there. Now, depending upon your organization, depending upon the industry sector in which you work, will depend upon which frameworks and which standards you will need to meet. And so, for example, if you work within a financial sector or within an organization that takes online payments, you will need to be compliant with the Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard, or PCI DSS. If you work within the health sector, you may also need to be compliant with the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, or HIPAA. And those are two notable laws and data security standards which we see a lot within the world of cyber. And regardless of whichever laws, regulations or standards you need to comply with, you will find the CIA as that foundation framework that sits underneath it all. All security policies will adhere in some shape or format to the CIA, and it allows for security teams to implement controls to protect information security assets. And just like everything within cybersecurity, it's purely a balancing act between maintaining confidentiality and integrity and the availability of the data. As soon as you make data available, for example, you then have the risk of the confidentiality and the integrity being impacted. And unfortunately, within the world of cyber, you will never ever be able to achieve 100% in any of those three aspects. It's also important then to have an underpinning knowledge about what security assets actually are to an organization. So an asset can be defined as a physical or digital object which is required to run and maintain a business. And assets can be tangible. Ultimately, that means that you can put a cost on them, or intangible, difficult to put a cost on, and invariably something that you can't physically touch. Some key examples include, and top of the list is always people. People are always the biggest asset to an organization, and the protection of people is paramount when it comes to cybersecurity. Closely following people will be data and information assets, and we see this time and time again that data protection is a key marker for most organizations. Under that would be our IT equipment and network infrastructure, sometimes just referred to as the infrastructure. And then, of course, every organization requires some kind of financial backing. So money is also a key asset to all organizations. And it doesn't matter what industry sector you work in. We can also get into the physical side of this as well, with the buildings and the sites where our organizations are located. And then when we get into the intangible assets, those that are difficult to put a cost on, we have things such as the company reputation or the brand name. And if you can imagine, if a financial organisation like a bank continued to have data breaches, that would have a direct impact on the company reputation. That may mean, of course, that they're going to start losing customers. So that would then definitely have an impact on the finances of that organisation, which in turn will have an impact on the running of the business. And that's one of the key concepts that you need to tuck away in any aspect of cybersecurity or information security, is that we are here to support the business. That's our ultimate goal. So what are these controls that we're talking about? And risk controls fall into three main types. We talk about physical, technical and procedural, or sometimes referred to as administrative controls. Physical controls would include things such as a CCTV system, a door, a fence or bollards. Technical controls, things like firewalls and antivirus software. And then procedural controls are the policies that we put into place. These can also then be subdivided up into the categories. So what do they actually do? Detect, deter, prevent, correct and compensate. And so, for example, a physical control such as a CCTV system is primarily in place to detect anything that's happening that shouldn't be happening. You could also argue, of course, that CCTV systems deter people from getting close to a building. And if somebody who's intent in trying to break in spots a CCTV system, it may deter them from doing so in the first place. We then have technical controls such as an intrusion prevention system, which stops attacks from happening. An interim control, which we just put in to mitigate something for a short period of time, may be a compensating control. So it fills in a gap until such times as the business can get a physical, technical or procedural control in place, which is going to be more of a permanent feature. So what controls do we use within the CIA? Let's go back to confidentiality. And some great examples here are technical controls such as encryption or cryptography. We can also layer in different access controls, and these can be physical, technical and procedural controls. So there are lots of different options you have when it comes to controlling access. You may have a physical control such as a safe or a lock, technical controls such as virtual private networks that encrypt data as it moves across a public network. And then underpinning all of this, we will have our procedural controls in the form of a security policy. When it comes to the integrity of our data, the controls we may use are very similar. So once again, cryptography has a showing, this time probably in the form of hashing. Although you could also argue that encryption also provides you with the digital integrity of data. Access controls, as we mentioned before, and then we get into technical areas such as digital signatures, which uses cryptographic functions. Virtual private networks, again, will allow you to maintain the integrity of your data as it moves from one place to another. And once again, the procedural controls underpin all of this. And finally, controls that we put into place for availability are numerous. So I've already mentioned the fact that we may use high availability systems such as failover clusters or load balancers, which maintain the continuity of things such as web servers and database servers. We then also use a whole series of redundant systems. Again, these could be physical or technical controls, such as a standby generator or standby network devices. We also use something called a redundant array of independent disks to maintain our data. Backups fall into this environment as well, as indeed does maintenance and patching. And one thing to remember is that all systems should be well maintained and updated at all times. Cloud and cloud technologies also allow us a certain amount of availability, because most of the times the systems that we use come with a degree of redundancy and resiliency built into it. Everything that we're speaking about here from an availability point of view is underpinned by a policy. So we have backup policies, for example, we have cloud security policies, we will have a patching policy, and all of this allows us to layer in different controls to maintain our security. That layering in concept is something called defense in depth and breadth. And what defense in depth does, it gives us a framework, there's that word again, that allows us to use multiple control types to secure information security assets. This puts data at the heart of everything. And so invariably what we're doing is almost like a castle where we're putting different rings of defense in place to make sure that we've got some kind of protection at all layers. And here it runs from data all the way through to the physical and procedural side of things. Cutting through each layer, however, there will be a procedural control, a policy. So how do we put the CIA into action? The framework itself is probably one of the most important used within cybersecurity and information security, and we kind of can see why that is. And it underpins most of the day-to-day operations within an organization. It also allows us to feed into risk management, and that's really the aim of what the CIA does for us. And there are lots of different resources that highlight this. And a classic example of this is when we use something called the CVE, or Common Vulnerabilities and Exposures. And this allows us to take a look at known or unknown vulnerabilities to our system and what areas within our systems may be exposed to cyber attacks. This then also works in very nicely with our risk management frameworks. So coming up, we're going to have a quick demonstration of how the CVEs work. And I'm going to go up onto the National Vulnerability Database at NIST to show us exactly how this works. So in this quick demonstration, I'm up on the NIST National Vulnerability Database and I've landed on the home page. From here, there's a whole load of different menus and information that I can get, and it also includes the last 20 scored vulnerabilities with their identifiers and some summary information about them. There's also the ability for me to come in and start searching for vulnerabilities, and I'm going to take that option. Let's take a look at some vulnerabilities with Microsoft. So if it was a particular vendor or a piece of software that I was interested in from a vulnerability point of view, all I need to do is put that into the search box, hit search, it will go away to its database and it will then return a whole load of different known vulnerabilities. Now for this particular demonstration, I'm just going to randomly select one. And so this one looks quite interesting, where it talks to me about Microsoft NAT 0.12.0 allows regular expression denial of service in the NAC introspection module, issue 2 of 2. Now I'm going to be completely honest with you, I don't really understand what all of that means, but I do understand what denial of service is. So that's a key thing just to tuck away if we take a look at this vulnerability. Over on the left hand side I can see the identifier for this particular CVE, and I'm just going to simply select that, and it will then bring me all of the information that I need to do some more research on it. So in my ignorance, I didn't really understand what this problem was, but by coming into here you can see that there's a whole load of information that I would be able to go and do further research on. For this particular presentation, however, we're interested in what impact will this particular vulnerability have on the confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So remember, of course, that we're talking here about a denial of service attack. If you come over into the vector section in here, there's a whole load of what looks like gobbledygook with a whole load of letters and numbers. Now, if you use this as an example and follow exactly what I've done, and again, just go in and select any vulnerability that you like the look of, if you simply bring your mouse and hover over the vector section within the metrics, it then breaks everything down for you and explains all of those different letters for you. So I can see here that the AV, or the attack vector, is local, so local access is required. The complexity of this attack is not particularly high, so it's low. And then if you come down through, you will see vulnerable system confidentiality, none. The vulnerable system integrity is none, but denial of service, remember, the vulnerable systems availability is high. So the impact here means it is going to have a high negative impact on the availability of this system. And that's pretty much what you would expect in a denial of service attack. There are, of course, lots of other different areas that you would be able to research within here if you're looking at this particular vulnerability. And the really cool thing about this NVD, it will also allow you to go off and look at the advisories, hopefully to get a mitigation or a resolution for that particular problem. But for this discussion, what I want you to focus on is the way that the CIA of security here is a big player when it comes to the assessment of the vulnerability for this particular threat. As I've already mentioned, the biggest challenge that we face when it comes to CIA is we need to recognize the fact that we will never be able to achieve 100% security. There's no such thing. And so, for example, I can guarantee you 100% confidentiality and 100% integrity of a system that is never started or is never accessed. So if you buy a new laptop, for example, and you never open it, you never use it, you never plug it in, or you never switch it on, the data that's on your hard drive is absolutely 100% secure. However, as soon as you open the lid of your laptop, you are no longer able to protect that data 100%. So this is the challenge that we face. How do we provide the highest level of confidentiality and integrity whilst maintaining availability? And this is where, as a risk analyst or within the world of cybersecurity, you need to know your assets. You need to know what data and information needs to be protected. You also need to know who and what needs to have access to it, and when do they need to have access for it. And this is all part of the risk assessment and process analysis that we do. So we achieve this by assessing the risks, looking at the threats and vulnerabilities. We also need to have a good understanding of what the business does and what the needs of the business are. And this is one of those things that underpins a role of a cybersecurity professional. We work alongside the business to make sure that it achieves its goals. You need to know your assets. We also need to educate people. And stay tuned, because I will discuss what I think makes a good user training and awareness session in another presentation. Of course, we also need to be able to employ those all-important risk controls, whether they be physical, technical, or procedural. What else do we need to consider? Well, this concept of non-repudiation, and this is where we protect against an individual who's able to falsely deny having performed a particular action. This can also be a system. It provides the capability to determine whether a given individual took a particular action, such as creating information, sending a message, or approving information, and of course also the reverse in receiving stuff. And non-repudiation goes hand in hand with technologies such as digitally signing code or digitally signing emails. We also need to consider the authentication side of things when it comes to the CIA. And this is all about the verification of the identities of our users and our systems or processes. And that's also a prerequisite to allowing them access to the resources on a system. So here you can also see that we're talking about controlling access, confidentiality and integrity. And as I've mentioned, the CIA really underpins the world of information and cybersecurity. And if you're currently studying for an exam or just for your own personal development, make sure that you have a good understanding about what these concepts are. And I can almost guarantee whatever course, whatever exam you are studying for, this is definitely in the test if that's important to you. And a great thing to do is when you hear about cybersecurity incidents on the news or reading them in newspapers, for example, always analyse them. Say to yourself, what actually are we talking about here? Is this a breach of confidentiality? Is it a breach of integrity? Or is it a denial of service in the form of a denial of availability? Or was the attack a combination of all three? Another great thing to do is yourself analyse what would you do. Put yourself in the position of the CISO or the technical teams that are fighting this cybersecurity attack and think about how you would use controls to mitigate them. As soon as you start getting into that kind of mindset from an analytical point of view, you know you're well on the road to success within the world of cybersecurity. Hopefully you found this session useful, and I certainly hope there are a few takeaways for you, whether you're new to cybersecurity or whether you're a seasoned professional. Yes, I write blogs, so please check out cyberphil.co.uk for any thought pieces that I've posted. And of course, hit like and subscribe to the channel. And don't be shy, give me some ideas about subjects or areas that you'd like me to discuss in the future. And hopefully I'll see you back on this channel very soon.